liberals are very hesitant to criticize the views and the values and the behaviors of other cultures. But they're very eager, oftentimes, to criticize the same within their own group. So they become overly tolerant of bad elements within other cultures, but hypersensitive to problematic issues within their own culture. In this case, with white male American culture. Greens feel free to criticize that and even use hierarchical judgments in their this is better than that, and I will use shame in order to make sure you understand why this approach is better than your approach, and so forth. But when it comes to looking at other cultures, there's no shame, there's no hierarchy, there's no discernment of what is more or less appropriate, and that becomes a big problem. On the other side of the aisle, conservatives tend to be very quick to criticize other cultures, but tremendously resistant when it comes to criticizing their own, which makes a lot of sense considering what ethnocentric means. So somewhere in that crossfire, Ken, I think that a legitimately sophisticated postmodern concept of privilege, majority privilege, has devolved into this pre-modern identity politics of white privilege. And as usual, the baby gets completely lost with the bathwater. And I'm wondering if you think it's worthwhile trying to save that baby.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problems, again, with so many of the issues that we face today is that we really don't have a very good understanding of the actual historical development over thousands and thousands of years. And the whole point about sort of evolutionary theory in general is just this general idea of a competition for survival. Mm-hmm. Certain groups have certain advantages, not necessarily in a universal sense or in absolute sense or even in a moral sense, but certainly in just a local competitive sense. Certain groups win over other groups. It might just be an expression of power, but there's something that makes most groups that win have some kind of, at least in that circumstance, some kind of exceptional capacity that lets them do that. It's certainly true of football teams and basketball teams and et cetera. So the same thing was happening historically. Now, it just turns out, as we were talking earlier, that for whatever reason, worldwide, the first culture that really started to talk about universal rights of all people, and that all people should be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. Well, for whatever reason, the group that first, in a large scale, devised that idea were a group of white, cisgendered, European males.
Those devils.
And as I say, because for whatever reason that they had been in power, nonetheless, they also created these notions that would, in effect, relieve them of power if applied the way the principles are meant to be applied. And that's actually what started happening. So we did start to see an extension of the vote to other minorities. Never happened before. We saw a demand that everybody be included. It started with all men are created equal, and literally meaning males. That could extend to all males and females of any race, of any ethnicity, of any gender, however you want to conceive that. This is unheard of. But again, the culture had been created around a majority rule, because that's what all cultures do. There really just isn't a minority rule of a culture. You don't get to rule a culture if you're just a small, ineffectual slice of it. So in some ways, some of the things that we call privilege are a historical exceptionalism that is no longer appropriate be recognized as exceptional. And so there's still that transition that needs to be made. And I gave some examples earlier about how we are making those transitions in an enormous number of ways. And like I said, we already have laws that make it categorically illegal for any person to marginalize, mistreat unfairly any race, any sex, any gender, any ethnicity. It's against the law. Now, the problem is that almost nobody at first here, that includes olive green and olive orange, if you're just looking at the law, that's what governs your exterior behavior in the public sphere. It doesn't cover your interior.
Right.
And the interior is where all that intent is, and all those identities going from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integrated. None of those make it into an observable public sphere. So you can't see the necessity of those to get to the level of values that you're embracing and that you want everybody else to embrace.
Right.
And so that becomes a real issue. Part of the confusion of in the culture wars with the extreme green, particularly in the far left, extreme left manifestation of that, one of the major ways that it gets its overall value structure is not that it's cognitively green and then self-related lines are green. That was the ideal. That's where it started out. That was what the best of the 60s was doing. The problem is that as that green became more extremist and more absolutistic in its orientation, and then its believers became more and more zealous and almost fundamentalist in their orientation. Remember, Clare Graves referred to the upper three stages in first tier. Amber he called absolutistic. And then because it had one perspective and that was the one correct way to see things and there were no exceptions. And if you disagree with that, you're going to burn in hell and all of those things. And they were all ethnocentric. So they were racist, sexist, and so on. And people that are down there today really are people like white supremacists, neo-Nazis, KKK. That really is amber ethnocentric. That's what it looks like. And by the way, they don't mind being called racist. I mean, they're saying, yes, that's what I'm doing. Right? What's the problem? The only people that get upset by being called racist are people who aren't racist. And that's what makes so much of the far left critique so idiotic. But the difficulty is that even if they start out at that green, and as green becomes sort of increasingly broken and extremist, and they become more and more zealous and absolutistic in their belief, they actually end up regressing to the absolutistic stage, because that's where that value feels right, is down there at that actual rung of their own development. Now, they don't lose their cognitive capacity when that happens. Their talk is still green, and they're still mouthing all of those slogans, but they're living them from an amber ethnocentric stage. So their value now they've retribalized, and it's my tribe is the tribe that has the one absolutistically correct way to see this. So much so, I don't even have to talk to anybody else because I know what I'm saying is right, and I can't possibly not be right, and there's no reason to even talk about it. And the fact that you don't agree with me, I don't have to argue the merit of it. Is if you disagree with me, I know categorically you're wrong, you're immoral, you're evil, and you're wicked. And if I have my right, I'll shut you down. And you disagreeing with me is an attack. It's a microaggression. It's a form of violence on me. And if you do that, I have the right to attack you first. I have the right to shut you down, to hit you, to stone your building, to spray mace in your face, whatever the violence of Antifa and the far left is. And they think that's absolutely justified because they're retribalized, they've regressed to ethnocentric, absolutistic amber. And even social commentators who don't have an understanding of developmental stages, they intuitively understand what's happening. They actually call these folks the regressive left. And they have regressed. But again, only in their walk, self-related lines. Cognitively, they still have a green capacity. So they still talk that lingo, but they're not living at that. They are coming straight out of that retribalized amber ethnocentric. And so what they find down there at amber is all of their roommates are the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, the KKK, the regressive left, the far left, absolutely. And they're all down there in the same retribalized, ethnocentric warfare. And that's why the culture wars have become so unbelievably polarized. Is that ethnocentric stage, there's no world-centric commonalities. When you talk about, you have to be identity politics. You are just a woman, or you are just a black person, or you are just gay. And when you talk about your tribe, if you're talking about you're a woman, then you have to say why your tribe is different from all the other tribes. So you spend all your time explaining why your tribe is different. You don't spend your time saying what your tribe has in common with other tribes. It's just how your tribe is different from other tribes. That is a prescription for social disintegration. That is retribalization. There's no world-centric aspects to it at all. And so we stop working for a common culture, a common society, where yes, we have diversity, but it's a unity in diversity. If it's just diversity, then you're one tribe, you're another tribe, you're another tribe, and we're at each other's throats. And the only end point of that is a literal civil war. Right now, we've got the most highly polarized political culture since we began testing polarization. It's never, ever been higher. It's alarming, and it's getting worse. Well, the whole point about left hand lagging behind right hand, this was actually the fundamental insight of Marx. That's actually what he wrote about. And what he noticed was, of course, he tended to be materialistically oriented, so-called dialectical materialism, which were schools that had developed after Hegel had, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel had introduced these stunningly amazing developmental views of reality. And they were the first really evolutionary thinkers, philosophers in history, and were really tracking stages of development, which was a radically new idea. And it was actually from them that the ideas seeped out. And several decades later, people like Charles Darwin went out and was looking for that in biology. But those are really sort of amazing points of view because all of the German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, all had a conception of spiritual dimensions. And in the wake of that, the materialists said, no, wait, there's not just spiritual, it's all material development. So Marx tracked historical development through a couple of stages of development, from archaic and what he even felt were sort of early communist forms, and then up into eventually the Middle Ages and the whole feudalistic stage. And it was his materialist orientation was that it was the windmills that created a feudal lord, for example. So it was tracking that. But what he noticed is that these technological artifacts can be produced much faster than humans can orient to them. So what happens is you get a culture that's adapted, created by a particular techno-economic base, might be windmills, And then a very small number of people introduce the next technological development, and they'll start building it, and then a small culture will grow up around that new technological development. And as that continues, the tension between these two becomes profound, because the old technological culture has the power, but the new ones are at a higher level of development, and eventually there's a revolution and the higher stage takes over. And that's what he traced. And of course he felt capitalism was going to be superseded by a communistic orientation. And so that still tends to be the case. That's as everybody's has some partial truth. Marx is onto a true but partial kind of notion. What we see, though, is that there are indeed all of these structural factors that are put in place in the lower right. And they are put in place first. The internet was there before social media and the echo chambers of polarization. I mean, it happened like that. So one of the things that's happened is that if you take something like poverty and you say, okay, now with all of these new laws and rules and regulations in place, what's going to actually cause poverty? The people that are actually in poverty in this country, what do they all have in common? And there have been several think tanks, left and right, Brookings, Hoover, all of them, have actually done statistical analysis of people that are poor and people that aren't poor, and what you have to do to not be poor in this country. And all of them agree there are just three things. If you finish high school, if you get a job, any job, flipping burgers, it doesn't matter. If you get a job and don't have a kid out of wedlock, you do just those three things, there's less than a 5% chance you'll be in poverty. The number of two-parent black families below the poverty line is 6%. The number of single white female families under the poverty line is 22%. Where's white privilege?
Right.
So, and by the way, those three factors, not one of them says be white, not black.
Right.
Not one of them says be male, not female.
Yeah.
Racism and sexism aren't even in that picture anymore.
Right.
Where the hell is the white privilege?
Right.
It's nowhere. So where's the masculine privilege? It's nowhere, not in that kind of regard. And those kinds of things are spreading. So we're still going to see individual differences, and to the extent that they're there, whatever group differences are there. And that's the factor that we have to face in the coming years is, again, what of those, why is somebody finishing a race ahead of somebody else? Is it oppression or is it some sort of capacity? And that's a difficult question. I don't want broken green answering that question. I want teal answering that question.
Amen. Amen.
Identity politics is important in a developmental sense because, again, just using the very simplified, broad ways of development from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integral, everybody goes through those ethnocentric stages. Everybody goes through an identity politics stage. And they're absolutely crucial for personality formation. It's something that has to be kept in mind as we move towards global world federation, that we still have to have people develop their identities. And so there's still some role for nation states to help get them from ethnocentric towards world-centric, and then start identifying with global humanity. But we can only do these things sort of one step at a time. So these are important. What we have to be very careful about is that our identity politics recognizes that it works only if it understands it's part of a world-centric unity and diversity.
Yeah.
It can't be just diversity.
Yep.
That's tribalization. That's everything humanity fought against to end bigotry and slavery. None of those got ended when we were at ethnocentric stages of development. They were all heightened
Yeah.
on the basis of wars and serfdom and slavery and misogyny and you name it. And we got out of all of those by moving to world-centric. And if we now just start re-emphasizing identity politics, ethnocentric, we're cutting under that great world-centric umbrella of moral fairness for all. And that's a disaster. And that's part of what's happening right now. So we have to really, really be careful about that.
Yeah.
And the far right and the far left, neither one of those are helping. Because both sort of sucking into that identity politics, tribal orientation.
Yeah.
And that's really a problem. If you see it as part of an ongoing embrace of a broader identity that allows you to see what all tribes have in common and how we all should be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed, then it's great. Mm-hmm. And every person should be proud of their ethnic orientation, their sex, their identity, whatever it is. Right now, of course, you're allowed to be proud of any ethnic origin you have, except being a white male. So you're allowed to say, I'm proud to be gay, I'm proud to be black, I'm proud to be woman. As soon as you say, I'm proud to be a white male, worst thing you can do. You're not allowed to say that.
Yeah.
You are part of the official oppressor class causing victimhood.
Yeah.
That's another problem with that. What's prejudiced or bigoted is if you meet that purple person and without getting to know them at all or find out about who they are, you simply assume that they have that low IQ. That's prejudice. That's bigotry. That's what you're not allowed to do. And that's what the orange, world-centric revolutionary freedom movements did, which started to extend rights and freedoms to all people, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. The whole point was you're not allowed to judge somebody based on in some group characteristic, particularly ones that are immutable. If you can't change your skin color, why in God's name does that become a defining factor of whether you have character? You have no choice over that. You can't build character, but you can't change your skin color. It's like saying, well, you have to be at least 5'10" in order to be considered a good person. That's not allowed. You're not allowed to judge a person based on immutable characteristics over which they have no control. That was what the Western Enlightenment got rid of. That's what these universal rights and freedoms brought. That's why we ended slavery with that period alone. It had never been ended before. So right now, and there are unhealthy versions of that as well, things can go wrong on that. But today, in the culture wars, those orange liberal values are relatively healthy. What's not healthy are green. Green started healthy, it got extremist, and it's pretty badly broken today. And then amber itself has some healthy versions. A lot of them are also broken and extremist, and they really are white supremacists or neo-Nazis or KKK and so on. So if we look at orange and green, here's the choice. And notice these are two very different factors, but they go together. It's a choice between a lower level that's healthy versus a higher level that's sick. And those go together. So if there is a telos for this development, that's what you're getting pulled to, a higher sickness. And that's the actual inherent drive now, that development is going to show up in that culture. That's what it's doing. And that's what gets frightening, because we really are producing increasingly broken, extremist green. And it's completely dominated the campuses, so much so that it's absolutely driven out any conservative view from the humanities entirely. I mean, people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt will say, well, in the humanities, psychology, sociology, human sciences, there are no conservative thinkers at all, none. In 1960, the ratio of liberal to conservative professors was about 4-1. Now it's about 30-1, which means there are no conservatives. I mean, that's about as broken as you can get. And of course, I'm not just a conservative. I believe they have to be integrated. But it's disastrous when higher education is no longer education; it's an indoctrination into an ideology.
Right.
And that's as badly broken as you can get.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's out of the campuses that future culture comes, and that's where it's headed right now. And that's absolutely catastrophic. So it's also pretty interesting that with this whole thing called the intellectual dark web, every single one of those, even though they will actually associate themselves with either the left or the right, and there are people across that entire spectrum from very, very strongly right, like Ben Shapiro, to very, very strongly left, like the Weinstein brothers, but every single one of them has used this identical phrase to define their political orientation, including Jordan Peterson, including Charles Murray, including the Weinstein brothers, including Ben Shapiro. They say, I am, quote, a classic liberal. That means they are representing orange, world-centric liberal values, because those are the ones that aren't getting included. Those are the ones that are completely broken when it comes to green, and they're just absent at amber because you haven't moved up to them yet. And so that's the nightmare. And the entire intellectual dark web, not one of them, literally not one of them has ever been invited to an organization that was left. They're only getting invitations from organizations that are right oriented. And so that's just astonishing. That's an example of how badly broken the cultural leading edge is. That's and unfortunately, that's the telos that we're offering to our young up and coming generation. And it's truly culturally nightmarish.
Yeah, it really is. And Warren Farrell has similar experiences where, he's like, look, I'm a pretty left-leaning dude, know, and yet when I talk to liberals about my work here, it's just like either get mad at me or they're just completely apathetic.
Right.
I go to conservative audiences and show them this work, and they get, really much more excited about it.
Right.
So it is a big problem.
One of the things that people have a very hard time understanding now, and it's actually confused pretty much everybody who considers himself a liberal or on the left, and that is up until the 60s and into the 70s, to be left meant to be orange. And you were for those original liberal values, you were for individual rights and freedom and fairness across the board. And when kids grew up, particularly boomers, the best and the brightest were liberals, because to be conservative and traditional, those were the ones that were still kind of supporting racist, segregated culture, and fairly patriarchal in terms of orientation to women and stuff like that. And so if you were at all evolved and advanced at that period, you were orange and you were a left liberal. And that's what the left meant to you. And so it had a moral weight to it. And then as green started to emerge and we moved from these orange universal rights, treating everybody fairly, where freedom was emphasized as equal opportunity, then this moved into a relativistic stage, what Grace called the relativistic stage. And now instead of just saying, oh, there's this one basically better way of viewing things, now it was, no, wait, other cultures have truths. Those deserve to be included. We need to take those into account. So we got this multicultural view where diversity is our strength. The problem is they could differentiate all those different cultural views and truths and values, but they couldn't integrate them. They didn't have enough cognitive strength to do that. They could differentiate them, but not yet integrate them. That wouldn't happen until second tier. So in the meantime, all Green was sure of is that because it believed in equity, not so much freedom, but equality. And it absolutized equality the more it got absolutistic in its own orientation. So the one thing it was sure of is that if you look at all the different groups that are out there, race, sex, gender, creed, whatever they were, they all had equal value. That goes without saying. Therefore, they all should be exactly the same in terms of their accomplishments. And if you find any group accomplishing more than another group, it's because that group is oppressing that group. That's the only cause. And so all of a sudden, because they absolutized that equality value, then they started devaluing freedom. So free speech, and that's not important anymore. As a matter of fact, you're allowed to interrupt freedom in order to get equality. And you actually have to oppress freedom to get equality. So Alex de Tocqueville first pointed out that because humans are born with differences, then you can either have freedom or you can have equality. You can't have both.
Right.
And that's right. If you're going to have absolute equality, then you have to erase freedom. I mean, if you're going to have, let's say, absolute equality in the NBA, then you're going to have all races absolutely equally represented in basketball teams. So you're going to have the same number of Jews that are represented, same number of Muslims represented, same number of blacks represented. And in order to do that, you're going to have to curtail freedom because some of those groups are better at it than other groups, and you're going to have to deny them freedom to actually compete. So you're going to have some sort of quota system, and that's going to interrupt freedom. So
Right.
that's gone. And if you have freedom, though, you won't have equality because people have, and among other things, just different interests.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to want to do different things. And so there's not going to be equal outcome, which is what Green wants. And what nobody understands is because the original leftist political orientation was orange, and then this new green value system developed, and progressives, leading edge progressives, moved into green, then we had two branches of the Democratic Party, and they violently disagreed with each other. And one were the old liberal original Democrats that believed in freedom and equal individual rights. And then you had the new postmodern green, and they were Democrats that believed in group identity and identity politics and group rights. They wanted absolute equality, not freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where many of the people that were brought up in the original left, that was for freedom and equal rights and all that, they kept saying, I don't know what happened to the Democratic Party, but I can't believe that anymore. These guys have lost their bloody minds. And so you actually have very famous like videotapes, Dave Rubin, why I'm no longer a member of the left. Because what had happened, when the left was calling itself this far left, extreme, green, multicultural diversity, equal outcome, or equity for everybody, that's what original liberals saw as absolutely anti-liberal. And it was. They were books written on the liberal left. And it was shocking to people because they couldn't understand what happened, how that drastic change occurred. And that's why now there's so many people that saying, I didn't leave the Democrats, they left me. I have no idea what these people are doing, but they're insane. They'll think that their nation state is just at this conventional conformist stage of development. but actually the rules, the governing principles of nation states come from that universal orange state. And that's where the Constitution comes from. It's a set of orange values. And so when it says things like all human beings are created equal, it doesn't mean all human beings in the United States.
Right.
It means human beings, period, all of them. And so that's why these original principles were applied to begin with only to those people who are already in power. So everybody's equal, everybody has freedom. That applied to basically white, propertied, able-bodied, cisgendered European males.
Yep.
Then that got extended to blacks, and that got extended to women, and that got extended to LGBTQ, and that got extended to virtually every minority you can think of, and we're still looking. And every single one of them is now under that tent of universal freedom. And so that is a good thing. But that's the trouble that Green has a hard time recognizing.
That's right.
And so it will often want to just sort of, because it is the sensitive self, and it really is looking for oppression, particularly the types of oppression that Orange said they would cure, but never quite got around to. So Green revisits race and revisits sex and gender and ethnicities. And the problem with that is that identity politics really does have a tendency to reactivate tribalism or an actual regression to amber absolutistic. And that's one of the problems with that. Because what happens when you talk identity politics, and this, whether you're on the far right and you're talking about superiority of your race, whatever it might be, or whether it's on the far left and you're talking about the identity of victim groups and how that's your primary characteristic is your identity with that group. In both of those cases, all you're doing is emphasizing how your tribe is different from all the other tribes.
That's right.
Never talk about what your tribe has in common with all the other tribes.
Yep.
So you, by definition, are ethnocentric. You're not world-centric. And that's the problem, because humanity, particularly in the West, that's what they fought for hundreds of thousands of years, is to get over those ethnocentric orientations and find a broader world-centric universal rights of humankind. Not just your rights as a Christian or your rights as a German or your rights as a French person. Your rights as a human being, period. And those are equal for every person who's a human being.
Right.
And that's what made those extraordinary.
Yeah.
And nation states, to the extent that they really were these post-conventional nation states, they incorporate those values into their governance systems. So we don't know now how quickly, or if at all, that nation self-identity can just be bypassed as we go global. And it's a real problem.
Yep.
And so you will have people that are green, for example, and sort of have, again, this sense of totalitarianism, although, again, they can't really do that by itself because they favor certain values and they claim those values are better than those other values. So they really don't believe in egalitarianism, but they're trying to get the point across, is that you want to treat all people fairly, regardless of race or color or creed or gender, or any of that. But again, that's what all tribes have in common. That's not just what your tribe has in common. So we see people are at green and are often trying to really just sort of the nobility of that kind of orientation, then they're the ones that tend to believe, for example, it's a completely open border. And they can even consider Borals to be immoral.
Mm-hmm.
And this is confusing two things. It's confusing just all human beings. Are all human beings equal? And the answer to that is yes. But then, okay, now how do we actually create functional gatherings of those human beings in a way that they can meet their fundamental life needs, desires, food, shelter, family, and some sort of income, and so on. And so far, that's dependent on creating nation states with actual borders, and then whatever a nation state does, whether it does it or not, it focuses on doing just for the people in its borders. So whenever we sort of hear like about multiculturalism or something, it's always about how our Western culture needs to import cultures, other cultures from overseas. But it's never vice versa. It's never like what Eritrea needs is some more Welsh food. Or, saying, well, why not? I mean, it's multicultural. We just don't know how much of a jump can be made from, in terms of just self-identity. Can I really go from just a local community to a global village? Can I, and I mean, seriously, incorporate that in my own perspective system.
Mm-hmm.
So if I say, well, yesterday I was concerned with what was happening in my community, now I'm concerned with what's happening in Afghanistan and South Africa and Argentina and Peru, and that's what I am right now, really. It doesn't look like that can happen. And so that's part of the things that we have to be working out. And the only way to work those things out is to include the left-hand quadrants
right.
in the discussion.
Yep.
And those on the table. That means when we talk about things like open borders, closed borders, all of that, we're not talking what those interiors actually are. We're just talking about exterior moves that you can take. Build the wall, tear it down. Really? I mean, it's embarrassingly anemic types of discussion. And this really isn't going to get better until we really do start including interiors as just these general orientation developments. And so one of the things that is, as usual, green is that, particularly because it's a largely broken green today, and I want to keep emphasizing that I'm really not even talking about healthy green, but it's really an extremist broken green that does have a regressive tendency and tends to take its relativistic ideas, because if you really have a relativistic idea, and so you really don't think that it can be forced on anybody else because there's really no difference, everybody's equally relative. So how could you possibly say that you want your relativity forced on other relativities? It absolutely contradictory, makes no sense at all. So the more you get really wound up about this, and the more zealous you get about your relative view, the more you make it absolutistic, and the more you end up where absolutism feels good, which is at amber ethnocentric stages of development, and you are part of the regressive left. And that's a real issue. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, orange liberal per se doesn't tend to get caught in that sort of extremist absolutism. It doesn't regress that much. So we really do have the sort of low-ish leveled ethnocentric home of things like real neo-Nazis and real KKK and real white supremacists. And there are real black supremacists and across the board. There are feminists that there's a op-ed in, it's either the New York Times or the op-ed Post, head of women's studies at Northeastern, something like that, wrote how it was appropriate for women to absolutely hate every single man in existence, all of them, not just few, all of them. And that every white man should just quit his job, stop assuming any form of power. So, I mean, that's about as ethnocentrically prejudiced and bigoted as you can get. So what we're in the process of doing is continually attempting to extend the rights of even a majority privilege to more and more minorities. And that's something that actually has to be done. And because it's not where human beings started out.
Right.
It's where they evolved after some 300,000 years of evolution. And again, getting up to the point of even getting over something like slavery. It's only 150 years ago that happened. And that's just human nature struggling to work it out, but on the long haul, headed in the right direction. And that's encouraging. But so right now, the idea of things like white privilege, or even masculine privilege really is much more a holdover from earlier epics of our historical development, when something like that was not only common, but there was really no real way around it.
Right.
And so now part of our growth is learning to extend those. And that's what we're doing. And really, particularly starting with the 60s, and the boomers get some credit for it, not all. But there really was this expansion. I mean, the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act, the whole feminist movement. The difficulty still remains that because the culture originally was run by white male, cisgendered, heterosexual men, that's still taken to be the major form of oppression that there is. And it really does overlook, as you were saying, pretty much every group to some extent oppresses to some degree other groups. And every group, without exception, is a victim of some sort of oppression from other groups or consortia of other groups. And that's becoming just more and more dispersed. And the fact that there's just nothing but toxic masculinity and all of it's toxic, and that all women should hate all men, that it's nothing but a white oppressive society, and it's racist to the core. The charge is made by the far left every time you disagree with them on anything. It just automatically are racist or sexist. That pretty much exhausts their arguments.
Yeah.
And it's really outrageous. Again, it's, if you had white privilege and you went to China, see how far your white privilege gets you. It's not an inherent thing.
Right.
You're just born with, and you get to lord over everybody. It's entirely culturally contextual. And it's we're one of the cultures that has increasingly made it illegal to engage in any of those forms of exceptional privilege. It's just not fundamentally allowed. And what we still haven't dealt with and might never be able to figure out is some of these inherent interest differences that almost every group has.
Right.
And there's almost nothing you can do about that. But to simply keep saying, for example, that white privilege means that whites dominate in all forms of income. For example, there's actually a list of the top income groups in this country. The average American makes $48,000 a year. The two highest group in terms of income are Filipino Americans and Taiwanese. The typical Japanese American makes $70,000 on average a year. Again, this is compared to $48,000 for the average white American.
Mm-hmm.
Even French Americans make $63,000 a year. Iranian Americans make $66,000 a year. Dutch, $59,000 a year. Even Nigerians, blacks in this country, $61,000 a year average. And people from Ghana, $57,000 average a year. All of those are higher than white Americans. So you can't just say black people automatically don't make as much. It's just not true.
Mm.
And we're increasingly putting in place lower right quadrant structures, laws, rules, regulations that curb that kind of thing. And what we'll still always be open to is allowing people to express their own, whatever capacities they have that are genuinely different.
Right.
And the disaster, if you want everybody to finish the race at the same time, is you wipe out all of those. And that's the real nightmare. And that's part of the problem that we get from the regressive left nowadays. Overlooking their own power, their own drive, and their own wishes and beliefs that they're actually superior. If we look at something like today's transgender movement, it's very heated and it's very polarized. And what you have are one group of people, Benjamin said, typical of this, that is focusing on the upper right. And so they're focusing on just straight biological data. And the biology is pretty straightforward, with a few genetic anomalies. There are two sets. It's X and Y or X and X. And you don't get to choose those. Whatever you're born with, that's what you are. And every cell in your body has structure.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to change it by just taking hormones or surgery or something like that. So the people that believe in just that point of view really strongly would say that somebody who's transgendered is essentially suffering a mental illness because they're simply not recognizing the genuine reality the way it is. So Ben Shapiro, things like, my grandfather used to be a psychotic and he'd hear the radio talking, but we wouldn't go around and say, that's right, Dad, he is talking to you. Yes, go ahead. It's all fine. He said, because it was just false. So they're focusing on just that quadrant. Mm-hmm. Those who are for transgender rights, and New York City now, by the way, last I heard, it's growing daily, over 60 different official genders that you can choose, literally. Well, that's the way it looks in the upper left. And is that possible? Of course, it's absolutely possible. It's already happening. Yep. There are already people that feel that way, and they're that way, and they know that's what they are. Phenomenologically, that's real. And so you can't just deny their experienced reality. It's these kinds of things that cause constant sort of arguing And there's no real resolution to it because both of them are partially right.
That's right.
And so they can always argue that way.
Yep.
And you see the same thing at almost any discipline that you look at, including ones that are cause the most controversy in the culture wars, such as feminism. And there's enormous arguments. Most feminists, for example, don't even believe in upper right quadrant science.
Right.
They just flat out deny any reality to it. It's the product of a hyperlogical patriarchy, and it's meant to oppress women, and it just has no reality at all. And then they will sort of end up focusing in on one quadrant that they think is the most important, and that's the only one that they'll support. Yeah, well, I think people have a natural, people at particular stages of development have an inclination to get particularly upset about hate speech. The Supreme Court has already denied that it's a category. I mean, that's been decided. And the question is, if you see it as falling under a free speech rubric, then I don't think there's any question but that hate speech as a form of speech is protected by free speech. And again, I mean, the whole point about free speech is it's not to protect those things that you're comfortable with. It's to protect those things you despise. That's why it's there as a law. It's the worst thing you can think of is protected. That's why it's protected. It's because it's the worst thing you can think of. And so, on the other hand, because we tend to do this anyway, largely due to the green leading edge, and this is a healthy part of it, although it easily goes extreme. But it's looking at things like motivation for something like killing a gay person because they're gay, as long as it's also applies to killing a white person because they're white, or killing a black person because they're black, or killing lesbian because they're lesbian. And we tend to think that way. And I don't mind having laws that are worded in that way, because then it just becomes part of the motivation and is in a sense dissociated from free speech as an issue of free speech. Because I do think, and again, what the Supreme Court said, it's basically the only speech that's disallowed and that isn't protected by free speech is speech that incites violence.
Okay.
And of course, that makes sense. But otherwise, I think the whole point of free speech and the whole point, it's part of the Bill of Rights. One of the whole point reasons for making it a right is that think of the worst possible thing you can think of. That's what's protected. That's why it's there. They wouldn't put it there if it was, am I allowed to say I love mom and apple pie? Hey, we need a free speech thing to make sure you can say that one.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not what they were doing, and that's not why it's there. And this is the hard part of it. I mean, this is exactly part of the culture war issues. This is what put Jordan Peterson on the map. Mm-hmm. And the Canadian Bill C-16 looked like it was doing it out of compassion and out of care, but it was in fact violating free speech in that particular area. It was also instituting an absolutely horrid version of psychological growth and development, which is that you can just constructivism in the worst sense, which I can construct anything I want, and that's what's going to be real. I happen to think transgender people are have very, very real issues that are actually happening, and they do deserve to be treated as a legitimate minority. And that's because that's how they feel in their own upper left.
Right.
It's also true in their upper right that they have an XY or an XX chromosome, and that's not going to change.
Yep.
So unfortunately, these arguments pick on just one or the other, and they say, well, they either are XX or XY, that ends the story, or they focus on the upper left. You go, no, they can be whatever they want to be. Well, they're both right.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, and also, you know, what's your definition of hate? So I can say pretty easily when I'm talking to you right now, Ken, I fucking hate Nazis, man.
right.
Right? There's nothing controversial about that. I hate a minority. I hate a minority of people who happen to identify as Nazis. Nothing controversial about that whatsoever. At the same time, I go out into public, and something I would never say, I would never even feel an urge to say, but if I said out loud on a soapbox, I hate, you know, the N-words,
Right.
that my freedom of speech does not make me free of consequence.
No,
Right?
absolutely not. And it's funny too, because the only people, one of the things that the radical left does a lot, of course, is people that disagree with it, they're called racists or sexists or homophobes or transphobes or Islamophobes or whatever it is. And it's kind of funny because if you take somebody who's a real racist, I mean, an actual racist, somebody like a neo-Nazi or a member of the KKK or a white supremacist, and you look at them and you go, you're a racist. They'll go, yeah. What's the problem? Yeah,
Right.
I'm proud of it. Really? Yeah. And if you have somebody who, you know, thinks men are the greatest or something like that, and you say, well, you're a sexist, they'll go, yeah, that's my point. They're not the ones affected.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, you get the shame goes over their
they
heads.
don't have it.
Right.
It's the people that are free of it that we're yelling at each other and say, don't do that. And you're going, this is the wrong crowd to be saying, don't do that.
Yep.
Talk to the crowd that really are racist or sexist or homophobe.
That's right.
So, okay, that's essentially the two parties that dominated for several hundred years. Now we cut to the 60s.
Yep.
Here we started to see the emergence of a new major level of development. And in 1959, 3% of the population was at that new level. We call it green, pluralistic. Graves called it relativistic.
Mm-hmm.
It was destined to change just about everything. Again, in 1959, 3% of the population was green. By 1972, Jacques Derrida was the most frequently quoted academic writer in America. And today, green is somewhere around 20 to 25% of the population. So it's had a stunning impact.
Mm-hmm.
And what green is, in terms of its actual structure, is if you look at these unfolding levels of development, and you look at orange, orange is capable of forming, as you saw, a universal system. And it was the first to do that. And so it started talking about universal rights, and the universal nature of that allowed it to discover most of the modern sciences. Mm-hmm. And all of those kinds of things were profoundly good. They had downsides. We'll talk about those. But in terms of true but partial, there's some very important truths that this had hit upon. The next stage, particularly if you look at something like Commons and Richard's research, but the next stage after systemic cognition is a meta-systemic cognition. And that's what green was. So green, because it was a step up from orange rationality, it could look back and reflect on orange rationality. It could look back and reflect on all these universal systems that were supposed to be the same for everybody. And it started seeing all these different cultures and all these different interpretive realities. And it started saying, wait a minute, we can't reduce everything to just Newtonian physics. We're missing something big here, and it's going to be a problem. So with this meta-systemic stance, what they were doing was looking at the previous systems that orange rationality had created, and they were differentiating them into all sorts of different cultures, all sorts of different interpretations. They were capable of differentiating, but they didn't have enough cognitive power to integrate. So they gave us an enormous number of separate realities, separate cultures, separate truths, and this was called multiculturalism. And everybody has the same equal truth. You can't say one culture is better than another, because that's just to apply the old single system monolithic viewpoint. So there starts to be this huge battle between these postmodern disciplines and the previous modern disciplines. And so as that started happening, we got some increasingly severe conflicts between these two stages of development. The orange, remember, had introduced the notions of individual sovereignty, that individuals have rights, therefore they have freedom, and we should be aiming for equality. But what orange meant by equality was equal opportunity. Now, when green came along and it looked at that, it didn't like equal opportunity because that wouldn't really guarantee an actual equality of outcome. So what would typically happen under an orange value system is if you're going to have a race and like an Olympic race, 100-yard dash, 100-meter dash, equal opportunity means everybody who has a legitimate talent and all of them have a legitimate right to be able to compete. And if we're holding people back because of their race or their color or their sex or their creed, that's prejudice. That's what we're not allowed to do. But if we clear all of that out and make sure that everybody who deserves to get to the race gets to the race, then fine. We line them all up at the start line, we fire the gun, and off they go. And then whoever wins gets a gold medal, whoever comes in second gets silver, third gets bronze, and so on. Green postmodern relativism would look at that and go, no, because the people at the end of the race, they're still not equal. Somebody's still superior to somebody else, and that's wrong. So what you have to have, and it sounds a little bit goofy at first, except it happened everywhere, is that everybody gets the same medal. And this actually happened. I mean, there were Little League games where everybody who showed up for the game got the same medal. That was it. There was no winner, because that would be making somebody superior. And there are no superior anything. Everybody is equal. And that again means equal outcome, not just equal opportunity. So equal opportunity came to be often referred to as simply freedom, because we're giving people freedom to display what talents they have and so on. And then individuals who are more competent, who do better, then they're going to get a larger share of the rewards. Mm-hmm. At the very least, they're going to get a gold medal, and not just the same medal that everybody else gets. Green, on the other hand, came to call what it was doing equity or equality. And they actually don't like freedom. So Green, pushing for equality, is willing to suspend things like the First Amendment and free speech. If free speech upsets a minority, then according to Green, you have the right to outlaw that free speech. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, to somebody orange, that's a disaster. Free speech is sacred. But to Green, it's just part of an oppressive culture meant to dominate the oppressed minorities. So we have this huge fight occurring between freedom and equality. They're not at all the same. And so what we had as this green orientation emerged was the Democratic Party, or the left, ended up dividing because about half of the party, who themselves are sort of growing into green, they moved up to green values, and they started wanting the Democratic Party to stand for equality. And the other half sort of stayed with the original liberal values of orange. Mm-hmm. Individuality is important, freedom is important, and so on. Now, the Republican Party, or the right, because there was this opening as evolution continued, then the right also notched up. And so about half of the right moved up to orange, and the other half stayed at its traditional base of amber. So it stayed ethnocentric, a little bit racist, militaristic, patriotic, nationalistic. And the new Republicans that moved into orange, they were referred to as everything from neocons to Wall Street Republicans. They were embracing orange values. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, these orange Republicans, these sort of new right, ended up being the ones that, in today's arguments with the extreme left, they're the ones arguing in favor of free speech. Mm-hmm. They're the ones arguing for individual rights against government. They're the ones arguing for freedom. So they're arguing the same values that the original liberals argued in the Enlightenment.
And those orange Republicans brought a legitimate intellectualism, or at least upgraded the intellectualism of the right. I mean, I think, classic William Buckley Jr. being sort of the, one of the main kind of lightning rods for that conservative movement throughout the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, there was an enormous amount of truly sophisticated intellectual thinking that went on among conservatives. And they had the advantage because even though they were still anchored in amber, they were operating from orange, so they could actually argue world-centric principles. Mm-hmm. So they no longer sounded racist and sexist and jingoistic and that. And for the most part, they weren't. Many of them. And so we have the parties, and this is what has caused the main confusion starting from the 60s for about 50 years now, is we have both parties splitting. So we have the Democrats, the left, having both its old-time orange original believers in orange values from the Enlightenment. And then we have the leading edge left being multicultural, sensitivity training, postmodern, equity, equality, not freedom, equality. And in the Republicans, we see a split between the old-timey amber Republicans, and this includes fundamentalists, religious thinkers, evangelicals, and so on. And then we have the new Republicans arguing from orange, still grounded a little bit in amber, but arguing primarily from orange. So we have, in a sense, three now main political orientations: an amber, an orange, and a green. And Democrats are orange and green. Republicans are amber and orange. So both old-time Democrats and new-time Republicans needed orange.
Yeah.
The difference is the Republicans at orange are interiorists.
Yep.
The Democrats at orange are exteriorists.
Yep.
Other than that, they sort of agree. When it gets to the what's the cause, then they don't.
Yep.
But they do share a fair number of things. That's
and it's funny, Ken, because they, you know, to my eye anyway, they're both occupying a very uncomfortable space in today's politics. Because today, you know, you've got some of these orange moderate Republicans, you know, the George Wills or the Michael Steeles or the Mitt Romneys, or who are actually actively pushing against the direction that the rest of their party, the regression that's happening on, you know, and it's not that they're like championing liberal values all of a sudden. They're telling people to vote Democrat, not because they agree with liberal values, but because they don't want to see their own party regress any further, and they want to check. Similarly, you've got orange moderate Democrats who look what's going on in their own parties and on, you know, college campuses, and are just like, this is fucking crazy.
Exactly.
This is my party.
Exactly. And this is part of the real problem. And so this is also where it comes down to, while there's plenty of blame to go around, meaning on both left and right, we hold the left to a little bit higher standards than the right, for at least a few reasons. One is it is a higher stage of development. Now, again, everybody goes through all of these stages. All of them have to be included. So it's not just that, you know, one is right and the other is totally wrong. Everybody goes through these stages. And any sane society finds niches that individuals at each of these stages can operate from, because they're still there. They have very specific needs, desires, drives, motivations. And if you don't supply those, then you start to get a society that's going to tear itself apart. It's not going to last. So what we have now that's getting so incredibly tricky, well, and the other thing that we have to look at, green, postmodern, leftist thinking for a little higher standard, is that's now the basic leading edge of evolution.
Right.
So at a little bit higher than that, of course, is second tier, and there's about 5% of the population at that.
Yep.
We don't tend to see values really catch on until about 10% of the population reaches that. So right now, most of the people that are integral stages of development, they have no idea they're at integral stages. They try to explain themselves to their colleagues who are first tier something. They're green or they're amber, they're orange. And they just get that sort of blank stare back from them. And often they'll just stop trying to explain themselves And as I put it, they go back in the closet, and the majority of people at integral stages right now are in the closet. And either they just don't know about it themselves, or they've gotten tired of trying to communicate it to others. But that split between the Democrats is something we've talked a little bit about before, which is there's the old-timey original Democrats, which came from Orange and had genuinely liberal values. This was individual rights, individual freedom and equality, and that meant equality of opportunity. And that's where the original political philosophy of liberalism came from. And it was the emphasis on individual rights and freedoms. And then that stayed essentially liberal, and that was what the left meant until the 1960s. And then we got the emergence of green. And green was supposed to be, as orange, rational, liberal was modern, then green was postmodern. And as green was supposed to be postmodern, then in reference to orange, which was liberal, green was supposed to be post-liberal. And in both those cases, it meant it transcended and included the previous elements of the orange stage. Now, what happened with green is it started to get extremist fairly quickly. And because of that, it turned out being not so much postmodern as anti-modern, and started to simply criticize all of Western civilization. All of it is nothing but a toxic masculinity, power-driven, tyrannical patriarchy. It does have some of those elements, and the whole point of green, with its egalitarian belief, is to spot those problems and correct them. But as it got into extremism and said that that's all Western culture was, and we hate all Western culture because we believe in multiculturalism, forget the fact that multiculturalism as an idea never arose in any culture except Western culture, but it's all wrong somehow. But it also didn't just go post-liberal. It started going what was called illiberal or even anti-liberal. It didn't like individual rights. It didn't like free speech. So it was perfectly willing to suspend free speech if it offended any minority. Now, this is again taking certain important green values and running them out in an absolutistic, extremist, far left way. And that became not just green, but broken green. And that's one of the main problems we had. And one of the reasons we pick on the far left more than we would on something like the far right is that the far right originates and comes from amber. And that's what you expect. Amber is ethnocentric. It believes in racism or sexism or whatever its ethnocentric identity is. The oddity is it believes in identity politics perfectly. And it'll go, yeah, well, right, you guys got your identity politics. We believe in white supremacy. We agree with you. Everybody should pick their tribe and say that it's the best, and that's the way it goes. Well, we don't expect high morals from an ethnocentric stance. We expect high morals from orange and green because they're world-centric. So when you have the leading edge of culture badly breaking, you are holding it to a higher standard. And so, of course, when it massively screws up, and the worst screw up is that it holds its extremist beliefs so intensely, so absolutistically, that it can actually regress to the absolutistic level, which is amber absolutistic is what Claire Graves called the amber stage. And it is absolutistic, and it's also ethnocentric. So you have these broad world-centric green regressing to these ethnocentric, bigoted stances. And social commentators have actually, even though they don't necessarily have an understanding of developmental models in mind, it's very common to hear this part of the extreme left referred to as the regressive left, because that's what it's doing. So it regresses back down to the ethnocentric level. There it meets the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis and the KKK and all the other identity politics, social justice people that have regressed to ethnocentric. And that's the retribalization of the country we see going on right now, because ethnocentric is tribalized. And that's the whole thing that humanity fought for hundreds of thousands of years, is to overcome that ethnocentric stance and move into world-centric orange or world-centric green. And to see us regressing back down like that in this culture is alarming. And the primary blame for that regression goes to broken green and extreme far left. So that's a very, very real problem that we're facing.
Yep.
Now, as for this overall neo-liberalized politics of consciousness, I agree with some parts of it. I think particularly the explanation as it gets into like the 80s and 90s and what happened there tends to be a little bit more accurate. The idea that the 60s started and it was against welfare, it was against this self-sufficiency, that's just not right. It was in the 60s that we actually instituted welfare for the first time, really. And so, particularly with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, War Against Poverty, in the 1964 and 1965, those policies went through, and they were actual government officials walking through every slum area and telling the people in a given living area that the government will give you money if there's not an adult male present in this household. And they were paying poor people to break up the nuclear family, basically. And so at the beginning of the 1960s, the percentage of African-American families without fathers was about 20%. Today, after 60, 70 years of those policies, it's grown to close to 75%. It's alarming because you can take almost any really bad social problem that we face, including high school dropouts, teenage pregnancy, teenage addictions. Well, between 60 and 70% of those cases come from broken fatherless families. I mean, it's a direct cause of that. But that's something that you will hear, of course, conservatives talk about, plus conservative black, brilliant thinkers, Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, Larry Elder, Jason Hill. These are brilliant sociologists. And they point to that as the number one cause of problems for black culture in this country. But you can't even talk about that on the left. It's not even a topic open to discussion. So that's a little bit the timeline on how we're trying to get rid of welfare, not get rid of welfare. I think that's a little bit off on that quote that you read of hers.
Yeah, especially, Ken, I think especially because I believe most accounts of sort of the neoliberal project in terms of, the type of globalization we see today. I think most people track that back to like the mid 1970s as when it really started taking off. So I'm actually wondering if sort of that push towards neoliberalism was itself sort of a reaction to two things, to the countercultural uprising of the 1960s, where I think a lot of leaders in America are probably like, whoa, we almost lost our shit back there. Let's encode these values as quickly as we can. But plus the failure of the Vietnam War, which I think might have changed some of our geopolitical strategies to say, well, we can't just invade a country to prevent the spread of communism. We have to instead liberate them with the market, right? So they become so dependent upon the Western market that there's no opportunity for a slide into communism.
Well, yeah, what the Vietnam War did was introduce primarily a massive and irreversible distrust of American people for their government. We've never seen anything quite like that. There was always tension. People would often sort of make fun of politicians as they'll say anything. But there was still a relatively, politicians were held in some sort of esteem, and particularly good politicians were often admired. By the time of the Vietnam War and things like the Pentagon Papers and the realization that the government was flat out lying to the American people, then all of a sudden, members of Congress, in terms of their what they were thought of, the degree of value they were held in, rated somewhere right below used car salesmen. and it's had a hard time going up since then. I mean, recent polls showed what percentage of Congress do you trust? This was in the whole nature of fake news. And it came out to be about 23%. I mean, it's just like that. And that's a major break in this whole nexus agency of this society. It's a real problem. And then with our leading edge broken green continuing to break things, this is not going well.
Yeah.
But as far as neoliberalism and this overall piece, the various types of ways that were discussed, there are about 3 of them. All of those represent one faction of an overall integral reality. And they're just taking one and trying to emphasize it alone, and simply deny, cut out, sabotage the others. And that's the problem. We don't have this background framework that says, okay, there are at least all of these realities out there. Now, you can take up a different response to any one you want. Just make sure you cover all of them, because otherwise you're going to say something about your area and you're going to think it covers that area, and guess what? It doesn't. And so you're going to be, in a sense, half wrong and half totally screwed up. And guess what? You're not going to know which half. So good luck with that. And that's what we see happen. It's still what we see happening in politics. And I don't see any force out there that's counterbalancing that type of broken polarization, with the possible exception of a coming tipping point when we get at least about 10% of the population into more integral stages of development that inherently look for how things fit together first. Then they look at the parts and say, okay, what do we have to do here? Or what do we have to do here? But don't forget that part over there, okay? And then so we figure out something for that. Even if we can't figure out what to do about that, we put a big question mark on it, and it still stays up on the bulletin board, with all the other areas. It's just, okay, there's a question mark there. That means let's come back to that next month. Let's come back to that next year. But we don't forget it, pretend it's not there, and think that by working with one of these other areas, we've taken care of that, because we haven't. We've just bulldozed it, and it will actually bite back. It will sabotage what you're trying to do. And that's all we have of these wicked problems that keep sabotaging everything we try to do to take care of them, precisely because we insist on these broken, fragmented, partial approaches. And that's not going to change until we change that approach. In the horticultural, because women did produce food, Japheth estimates that upwards of 80% of the foodstuffs were produced by women. And in a sense, because of that, this is a little bit of a Marxist argument. It's true, if partial. Horticultural societies, a third of them had female-only deities.
Right.
Which is astonishing. Whenever those famous Great Mother societies, whenever you find a Great Mother society, it's a horticultural society. Astonishing. And then when it moved to agrarian and men were producing all of the food stuff, all of a sudden in those societies, over 95% of the deities are male only. Just those two simple factors right there. Nobody was oppressing anybody. It's not to say that certain kinds of oppression couldn't occur.
Of course.
It's just fundamentally, this was a major factor. And so men's upper body strength was selected by the techno-economic mode of heavy farming to be the ones to do that.
Right.
And now here's the big change. When we get to industrial and machines were created, all of a sudden machines were doing work on nature that therefore men didn't have to.
Yep.
That selective drive to select men, that dropped out. And when that dropped out, the force to have one sex be in one place and one sex be in another, that dropped. So we have the first treatises on feminism. We have the first understanding that women can start to work in the public sphere just like men can. As a matter of fact, almost all the minorities were released at that point, including in a 100-year period, slavery was outlawed for the first time in all of history.
Yep.
It never happened before. It happened because machines were doing work on the environment that previously men's upper body strength had to do. So that all dropped out. That's why we start to get equality start to show up during that period. Never ever, even the notion of it was unheard of in previous times. And so women started working very quickly at coming up with different roles that they could play. Men, for complicated reasons, remained stuck in the same old roles they had. They still had to be provider and protector.
Yep.
That was it.
Yep.
They weren't allowed to go rushing into the home and be a full-time father.
Yep.
That wasn't even an option.
Yep. It's shameful to be a stay-at-home dad.
Exactly. Yep. And so now what we're starting to see as we then move into the information age is, okay, that gives even a different relationship. That's a relationship not of muscle, but of mind. And so what we're starting to see as a different selection pressure in informational cultures is those do tend to select, although there's equal opportunity, anybody can get into them who has the qualities to get into them. But going back to that slight STEM selection, and by the way, the 4 STEM sciences, out of the top 30 disciplines that you get a degree in college, those are the only 4 where more men have college degrees than women. In all the other disciplines, biology, medicine, nursing, law.
Yep.
61% of those graduates are now women.
Yep.
61%.
Yep.
They're massively more than men.
Yep.
And the only places the men still dominate are the STEM.
Right.
That's why Silicon Valley has more males doing that. So what we're failing to do is adjust the roles that men and women have as the different demands that living puts upon men and women, and for the things they have to do in order to make a living, in order to stay alive.
Right.
And the men, by and large, unfortunately, women have pushed ahead in pioneering new roles for themselves. Men are still stuck with provider and protector.
Yep.
And what's bad about that is that there's less and less real need for either. Because women are working about as often as men, so men they don't need to be the sole provider. And in terms of protector, not many men want to go fight wars.
That's right.
Whereas in the past, that was one of the most common things that a man did. So the two major forms of meaning that men used to have for several epochs, provider and protector, those are pretty much gone.
Yeah.
And in its place, it's thought to be nothing but toxic masculinity. And that's why men are having such a nightmarish problem in finding meaning in their life. And this has showed up. Now, just give one statistic. Suicide rates among men in the late teens, it's 4 or 5 times greater than women.
Ugh.
In the 20s, it's 6 to 7 times greater than women. By the time a man's 85, the suicide rate is 1,860 times greater than women. It's off the wall.
No, and Ken, the fact that we're not treating this like the, sort of national mental health emergency that it is, only shows that we are perpetuating this myth of male disposability. It's not a problem because it's just happening to men, particularly white guys. Who cares?
Exactly. But women have just been much brighter at forging new roles to play.
Yeah.
Men have been horrible. And now it's gotten to a point where there really are a lot of books with titles like The Boy Crisis, The War on Boys, and so on. Many of the imbalances that were true in the 50s, they've been reversed today.
Right.
Just even college, for example, in the 1950s, 61% of college graduates were men, 39% were women. Today is exactly the opposite. 61% of graduates are women, 39% are men.
Yeah. Yeah, no, beautifully said, Ken.
So what we need is a human gender liberation.
Yes.
Because the problem in both cases is that the roles that men and women have today are still determined by previous epochs of techno-economic existence, when those roles made a difference. They were there for a reason. Men and women together selected those roles in order to stay alive. And those roles are no longer needed, but men especially are still stuck in them.
Yeah.
Women are stuck a little bit, but they're finding ways to move beyond.
Yeah.
And so what we really need are ways to free both men and women from archaic roles that were once appropriate and are now completely inappropriate.
That's right. Beautifully said. And, and it seems clear that if you are looking at history and all you see is oppression, there's a good chance that you have fallen into the fallacy that's known as presentism, where you are projecting today's values that are, that are enabled by modern developments in technology and modern cultural movements, all this stuff. You're actually applying today's values to a time when those values could not possibly have emerged.
Right.
Could not possibly have emerged.
Well, I mean, it's sort of across the board. And again, with some minor exceptions. But the whole point of the direction that evolution is driving right now is towards a global village.
Yep.
And a global village means an enormous number of different tribes interacting, interweaving, being interwoven, brought together, intermixing. That's the whole point. So, I mean, if we were to say stop that, then even something like the international style of cooking, does that mean, okay, stop mixing Italian food with that Chinese food and that Ethiopian food? You have to keep them all separate. What's more, you can only eat food invented in your culture, or else you're culturally appropriating something.
I hope you're not British.
Yeah. Should we only read novels written by people in your culture? You can't read novels from somebody else's culture. You certainly can't try to borrow them or use any aspects or be influenced by them. That would be horrible. How about medical discoveries, right? Only your culture's medical discoveries get to be used. As soon as you use somebody else's, that's clearly cultural appropriation. And you need to stop doing that. They don't have any of that in mind. I mean, it's really ridiculous. The part happens with this whole notion is because of that intense group identity politics, again, which is healthy Green's attempt to look at areas that were marginalized, get people to realize that, and then help bring those marginalized groups back into a world-centric umbrella, a world-centric embrace. But by latching onto it so strongly and so extremely, then all you are is groups. And as we said before, when you identify with just your group, just your tribe, then you're not learning how your tribe, what it has in common with other tribes, so you can actually be world-centric. You're only learning how it's different and how it should be separated and even treated differently. And so the more you do that, if that's what your whole worldview is about, then one of the things you don't want is those groups mixing with other groups. And particularly if one group initiates that, then that's cultural appropriation. That's stealing. And all that is virtue signaling by an extreme regressive left that's lost their fucking minds.
No, again, it's so funny. The people who get pissed off by shit like this, who get genuinely triggered, are not the people whose culture is being appropriated. It's usually white bystanders who just get outraged by this shit.
And the other thing, I mean, multiculturalism is we're supposed to bring other cultures in. And that also only works one way. I mean, you never hear them say, what Ethiopia needs is a few more Welshmen. Just get that down there and they'll be doing fine. No. So multiculturalism, it works for, by the way, the only culture in the history of the world that invented and agrees with multiculturalism is Western culture. And that's the one culture that's hated above all other cultures. That's not integral. That's a broken green.
But then in the 60s, a new stage started to emerge, which was the green, postmodern, multicultural. And even though liberals tended to inhabit both of those, because the liberals were progressives, they believed in evolution, they believed in science and so on. So as things started to keep evolving, liberals kept evolving, whereas conservatives kept holding on to the things that they felt needed to stay and that you shouldn't get rid of. So liberals would have protest signs like, revolution, revolt, change. And if conservatives had protests, it would be careful, slow down, hold on, don't do that. And that introduction of the postmodern, green, egalitarian, multicultural level of values to these first two, amber and orange, that created the three value structures that are now at each other's throats in the culture wars. That's what the culture wars are. And that's why they only came into existence after green started to emerge. Mm-hmm. And so most models take those into account. They have something resembling an amber, well, they have something resembling a red egocentric stage, or two, they have something resembling an amber conformist stage, or two, and then something with an individualistic world-centric stage, or two, and then a modern world-centric, and then a postmodern egalitarian multicultural stage. And the thing about the postmodern is that it differentiates all these systems that Universal Orange threw up, but it doesn't know how to integrate them.
Right.
So it just says, okay, they're all equal, because we don't know how to actually put them together. So we'll just say they're all equal. And that gets egalitarianism, and that gets into real problems. But almost all developmental models have a stage or two beyond the postmodern, pluralistic, Claire Graves called it relativistic, but a stage beyond that that fully takes into account all of the differentiations and multicultural sensitivities that Green has introduced. But then it shows how to start bringing them together. It shows commonalities that interrelate them, while also highlighting their differences. It doesn't deny that. It gives plenty of room for that. But it's a real unity in diversity. It's not just unity, which Orange had, and it's not just diversity, which Green had. It's a unity in diversity. And that's a big leap. Maslow was one of the first to emphasize the huge leap this was when he called all the ones leading up through postmodern pluralistic, he called those deficiency needs, because they're based on, you feel like you lack something, you have to go out and get it, and all the friction, and all of what was called first tier, all the stages leading up to that, including the selfish, the conformist, the modern individualistic, the postmodern multicultural, all of those felt that their values were the only correct values in existence. And then there's this leap in what Maslow called not deficiency needs, but being needs. And being needs is you're motivated to do something, not because you feel you lack it and you have to go out and try to grasp it and get it and own it, but because you're overflowing with this motivation, you're overflowing with this abundance, and you simply need to share it. You simply need to go out and make it available to others. Entirely different type of motivation. And it's also completely friendly with all of the stages that came before, because it just wants to sort of embrace and exude and be super abundant for all of them. You find something like that distinction. Sometimes the distinction is felt to be so great that some models, starting with Claire Graves and going into things like spiral dynamics, will actually call it first tier and second tier for deficiency needs and being needs. The big problem in the world right now, in which all of the problems that we're talking about are subsets, is that we've had this continuous growth in human evolution over the past 300,000 years. And then we got up to the top of first tier. And that's what happened starting with the whole 60s and the whole culture wars. And it came to a real peak starting around 2015 when the leading edge green had become so zealous and so frayed and so dysfunctional that we had, for example, the 2015 Yale, when Yale lost its collective mind and started telling students how to dress for Halloween. And then when the wife of one of the major professors there suggested that the kids can make up their own minds, thank you very much, the entire university exploded. And it was far left versus basically everybody else.
Right.
And far left had become so zealous, even though it is essentially the highest major stage that a bright person could attain. And about 5% had moved on to second tier being needs, or the really higher stages. But about 20% of the population was at this green. And that's where the leading, most of the bright students in college were. So their protests had gotten so one-sided and so zealous that they weren't protesting that they wanted to interact with the people, their opponents, and have an honest discussion or debate about what values are real. No, their approach was, we're so sure that we're right, and we're so sure that you're completely wrong. We don't even want to hear you. You're not even going to be allowed to talk. We're going to use the heckler's veto, and every time you start talking, we're going to either pull fire alarms or break windows or start screaming or something, but we're going to stop you from talking. That's a complete breakdown of leading edge green. That's as dysfunctional as you can get. And because it's embraced so absolutistically, it actually does tend to lend itself to a regressive movement. Remember, Claire Graves named amber, orange, and green, or traditional, modern, and postmodern. He used the terms absolutistic for amber, because it's ethnocentric, it's got the one true way. If it's a fundamentalist Christian, then everything in the Bible is true. You can't change it. If you're Islam, then the Quran is the one and only correct book, and it can never be improved. That's absolutism. And that's, there are some important parts of all of the stages that need to be transcended and included, goes without saying. But you really don't want to get stuck in just a pure zealot, absolutistic mode, because that can't hear any other perspectives at all. And that's a sure route to cut you off from any learning, any interaction, any dialogue, and so on. So the orange stage he called multiplistic, because it realizes, using rationality and science and so on, that there are many different perspectives that you can take to look at something. And that's where all the modern sciences exploded, when we had that realization. That wasn't just the church saying, this is what's true scientifically, this is what's true artistically, this is what's true morally, it's all under one roof and the church governs it all. No, that all broke apart. The quadrants actually differentiated. As Wilber put it, the value systems, the good, the true, and the beautiful, differentiated. And so that was multiplistic. And that's a very, very good place to be. As you go up to green, the ties became so tenuous because they were having a hard time integrating them all. He called that relativistic, because now it's just cut all of these value systems apart, doesn't know how to bring them back together at all. So all it emphasizes is identity politics. You go identify with your group, you go identify with your group, you go identify with your group. And by the way, when you describe your group, if you're a feminist, you're a woman, just describe what it's like for a woman. Don't say what it's like, what a woman and a man have in common. Don't tell us that. We don't want to know that. We want to know how they're different. So what they end up, and then they grasp onto those results with an absolutistic zeal. Whenever you grab an idea and latch onto it absolutistically, you'll tend to regress to the absolutistic level, because that's where psychologically you feel at home. Now, down there at the real absolutistic level are people that are there because they're just coming up, not because they've regressed down. So here you have the real neo-Nazis and the real KKK and the real white supremacists. Not very many of them, but they're there. And their chances of like taking over universities or something like that are zero. They're problematic because they cause enormous amount of social turmoil, and because they're absolutistic, zealot, rednecks often, at any event. So what you have is leading edge green regressing to the same level as these ethnocentric groups. And of course, leading edge green is ethnocentric identity. That's what you're supposed to do. So of course they're down there with all the other ethnocentric groups, and that's anti-world centric.
Right.
And that's the problem. So what we started to see happening is we've gotten up to the point where the leading edge really is green, and that really is the top stage of first tier. The next higher stage isn't just a stage development, it's a tier development. It's not just from conformist to individualistic to multiplistic. It's from first tier to second tier. It's from deficiency needs to being needs. And this is, we have no precedents for this whatsoever. There's never been a culture that was ensconced in second tier. There's still today in our culture, only about 5% of the population is at second tier. About 20% is at green. About, depending on what model you use, 30, 40% at orange. But the real pressure now is between this first and second tier. It's between green, whose inherent drive, whose inherent arrows, is to jump up to second tier. That's what's going to have to happen for the next stage in development. It will happen one way or another. But the problem is, in the past, we've had a hard time going from stage to stage. But imagine how much harder it is to go, not just a stage that is a stage, like when you go from green to teal, that's a real stage. But it's also a tier. It's also a leap in dramatically different types of motivation and types of awareness and types of integration. And that's never happened in our past historically.
Right.
The boomers thought it did. When they came in 1960,
Surprise, surprise.
right, in 1959, the percent of the population at green was about 3%. By 1972, Jacques Derrida was the leading academic writer in America, the most widely quoted, and the percent of the population at green was 12%, on the way to 20%. So that's where the leading edge is. I mean, the real leading edge is second tier. It's that 5% that's pushing into second tier. But the large, most definitive leading edge is this large green. And unfortunately, in too many ways, it's gone far, far left. It's gone radical left. It's gone zealous, and in some cases, regressive. And so you'll notice that some social commentators, even though they don't understand development, they'll actually refer to this wing of the leftists as the regressive left, because they intuit that they are regressing back down to amber, ethnocentric identity politics, which is a disaster in that sense.